Hello and welcome to this episode of Prasha's Murder Map. Recently, many of you have enjoyed my Penny Dreadfuls collections, which bring together several short cases from the Victorian era, so I'm pleased to bring you another set of grisly crimes from the 1800s. I call these Penny Dreadfuls because that was the name of the serial printed stories popular in the UK in the 19th century, a bit like dime magazines in the US. Dick Turpin, Jack the Ripper and Spring-Heeled Jack are all colourful examples of the kinds of popular stories from these publications, summoning up images of macabre mysteries, murders, mischief and mayhem, sometimes crossing the boundary between real and imagined, although the ones I'm presenting are tragically true and have been researched using a variety of sources. One of these sources is the International Police News, known as the IPN, which was seen as a successor to the Penny Dreadful magazines and printed sketches of high-profile crimes, like an old-fashioned graphic novel. It was so graphic, in fact, that it was banned in Ireland and some considered it to be a bad influence on the population. Regardless of their age, these cases are no less harrowing and the victims no less important than those from more modern times. Murder in Artillery Passage. In 1868, the Grossmith family ran a small cafe at 11 Artillery Passage, a dark and gloomy little alleyway connecting Artillery Lane with Sandys Row, not far from Spitalfields in London's East End. Mr. George Grossmith and his wife Emma had lived there for at least 6 years, and their 11-year-old son Walter ran errands for them and worked as a kitchen boy in the cafe when he wasn't at school. For the last 5 months, they had also employed an 18-year-old servant named Alexander Arthur Mackay, known as John, who worked long hours in the kitchen and waited at tables for a meagre salary. He was the son of an old family friend and had previously spent 3 years in a reformatory for larceny, so they felt they were doing him a favour by giving him honest employment. Emma, who was 45, was known for her hot temper and impatience, and she frequently scolded John for laziness or making mistakes. On one occasion, John had been given 10 shillings worth of potatoes to peel, but he couldn't be bothered with this laborious task and decided to hide them instead. By the time Emma found out, the potatoes had been spoiled and had to be discarded. Emma was furious and shouted bitterly at the slovenly servant. Young Walter saw how his mother constantly berated John and relished watching their fiery quarrels. He took every opportunity to make things even harder for him and once deliberately dirtied some cutlery that John had spent hours cleaning. He also observed that John had a habit of helping himself to beer that should have been served to patrons. Walter sneakily told his father and watched the sparks fly as George Grossmith rebuked the servant. But after he was out of earshot, he was startled when John whispered to the boy that he had had a dream about murdering him. Shortly after this incident, Mr. Grossmith had been alarmed to see John enthusiastically striking a large chopper into a joint of meat. "What in heaven's name are you doing?" he asked in exasperation, furious that this servant was messing about with the meat they would be dishing up to guests. The sinister servant smiled as he replied, "I'm practicing how to serve those that don't do as I like." Things came to a final and devastating head on the morning of Friday 8th of May 1868, when Walter adopted an imperious tone he had learned from his mother and ordered John to fetch him some water so he could wash his feet. "I'll be damned if I do," the servant exploded, grabbing a rolling pin and advancing towards the boy. Crisis was temporarily averted when Mrs. Grossmith entered the room and scolded him for some other misdeed. After she stormed out, Walter heard John mutter, "If that damn bitch does not mind, she could get into the wrong box and get something for her trouble." Walter delayed leaving for school, hoping to watch the argument that might ensue. By now, John had started his regular task of cleaning the shop windows, and he spotted the boy lurking inside the cafe. To pay Walter back for all the times he had told tales on him, he called out to his employers, "The boy has not gone to school." Mrs. Grossmith promptly ordered her son to get going and ushered him off immediately. Ironically, it was this that probably saved Walter's life that day. Later that morning, Emma Grossmith was making pastries in the kitchen and asked John to fetch her a clean cloth to wrap them in. Instead, he presented her with the dirty, greasy cloth, prompting the irritated woman to harangue him again. This time, John saw red. His already crumbling composure finally fractured, and any remaining shreds of self-control completely evaporated as he picked up the rolling pin and beat Emma over the head until she lay motionless in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. Several neighbours heard screams coming from number 11 and the sickening sound of repeated heavy blows. One passerby heard Mrs. Grossmith scream, "Oh, don't," 3 times, and then, "Oh, John, you will kill me," followed by a hoarse voice replying, "Hold your row." Mrs. Mary Sanderford, a widow who lived at number 13, knocked on the door to check that everything was all right. When John opened it, she saw that he had a scratch on his cheek and his clothes were covered in blood. Behind him, she glimpsed Mrs. Grossmith's battered body. "Oh, John, you have done this," she exclaimed. All traces of his anger now gone, the servant placidly replied, "No, ma'am, I have not." Mrs. Sanderford asked where Mr. Grossmith was, and John saw his chance, telling her that he would run and fetch him. Of course, he did nothing of the sort, and instead took the opportunity to escape. Local physician Dr. Jackson arrived to examine the victim of the violent attack, expecting to find her deceased given the level of injury to her head and face. Astonishingly, she was still alive, and the doctor moved her upstairs to the bedroom with the help of Mrs. Sanderford. Her wounds were so severe that when Mr. Grossmith returned to the house, he could barely recognise her. After a few days in hospital, she recovered enough to gasp out a few words to her husband and tell him what had happened. She was certain that she would never get better and told him, "I shall die. The pain is so great. I shall die through the pain at the back of my head." 9 days after the brutal assault, Mrs. Grossmith slipped into unconsciousness and never awoke. It was now a murder case. Had Walter stayed at home that morning rather than being shepherded off to school, he would likely have died alongside his mother. The hunt was on for John, real name Alexander Arthur Mackay. A friend of John's reported that he had recently seen him at Woolwich and asked what he was doing in the area, and John had replied casually, "Oh, just looking for a job." There was little progress for the next 2 months, but in July, a detective wondered if the young man could be in prison somewhere under a false name, as wanted fugitives had been found in these situations before, having been picked up by the police for other offences. A photograph of Mackay was found in his bedroom at 11 Artillery Passage, and copies were circulated to all prisons and police forces in London and the neighbouring counties. Soon it was discovered that a young man matching the photo was currently at Maidstone Jail in Kent, serving time for theft under an alias. He was brought to London and identified by witnesses as Alexander Arthur Mackay, or John, and he stood trial a month later at the Old Bailey. The jury found him guilty, but with a recommendation to mercy due to his age. But the judge weighed up the savagery of the crime and decided there was no room for clemency. The 18-year-old murderer was hanged at Newgate on 8th of September. The old cafe at 11 Artillery Passage remained in the Grossmith family, and even now is still in the food business, having been transformed into a Chinese restaurant. For the last few years, it served as the delivery entrance of the Otto Lengi restaurant, leaving no visible sign of the violence that occurred there over 150 years ago. The Norwich Mystery. In June 1851, residents of Norwich had an unpleasant surprise. All over the city, people were finding small pieces of human flesh in ditches, sewers and wasteland, and the police were baffled when a steady stream of members of the public brought in bones and skin that they had discovered in the most unlikely of places. After a while, the police had amassed a right hand, a right foot, a pelvis sawn in half, arm and leg bones, a kneecap, pieces of sacrum and vertebra, a breast with a nipple intact, and partial intestines. It was obvious they were dealing with a murderer, and not just any murderer, but one who had the coldness and the stomach to cut up his victim into hundreds of tiny pieces. The specimens were examined by 3 surgeons who agreed that the butchery had been carried out by an amateur, not a medical professional, and that the victim was a woman of about 5 feet tall, aged between 16 and 26. However, there were no missing persons reports that met this description, so the identity of the body remained a mystery, and the remains were buried in the cellar of the Norwich Guildhall. In fact, there had been a woman who disappeared around this time, but it had not been made known to the constabulary. 54-year-old Martha Sherwood had a small, delicate build and golden hair, and was married to a younger man, a 39-year-old pawn shop assistant named William. The pair had married in 1836 and lived in Tabernacle Street off the Bishopgate in Norwich. They had no children and made an unlikely match, resulting in a marriage that was far from happy. When Martha vanished in 1851, her husband told everyone that she had left him and moved away. Being a taciturn and unfriendly man, William had no close friends who found this suspicious, and the only people who noticed her absence were Martha's aunt and sisters. William insisted that Martha hadn't told him where she was going, and claimed that he'd asked her if she would write to her family even if she wouldn't write to him. He maintained that her answer had been no, and she had no intention of remaining in contact with her relatives, which was a very convenient story. Martha's family had concerns, but decided not to report them to the police, although one of her sisters knocked on William's door and said, "I have come to ask you about my sister. What have you done with her?" He replied, "I don't know. I've done nothing with her. She left me quite penniless. She cared nothing for me." After this, William Sherwood sold off their home and belongings, moved into a small room above a pub, and opened a pawnbroker shop of his own. He got remarried to a woman named Charlotte Buck, with whom he had 5 children, and described himself as a widower on the marriage certificate. His business was successful, and he sold it for a profit in 1868 and became a pub landlord, taking over the lease of the Kean Castle Inn in Oak Street. His new lifestyle and unfettered access to alcohol didn't suit him, and he began drinking excessively and suffering from insomnia, wandering around the dark rooms above the pub all night, holding a flickering candle as he paced the floors. On New Year's Day 1869, more than 17 years after Martha's disappearance, Sherwood travelled to London and handed himself in at Walworth Police Station, announcing that he had murdered his first wife in 1851. His bedraggled and unkempt appearance made the police think he was simply drunk, so they put him in a cell and told him to sleep it off. But the following day, Sherwood repeated his confession, this time going into more detail about what he had done. He told them that he and Martha had fought over money, and he had cut her throat and then dismembered her body, sawing up the bones and severing the joints before boiling her head in a pot. Once sufficiently disintegrated, he placed all the parts in a large basket and went for a walk, scattering them all over the city. It had been a perfect plan, and he had got away with it, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to rest. He had chosen to visit Walworth because it was where he and Martha had first met, and he had intended to commit suicide there with a razor. When it came down to it, he found he was more squeamish about cutting his own throat than somebody else's, so instead walked into the police station to admit his crime. William Sherwood was tried at Norfolk Lent Assizes on 29th of March 1869, cutting a sorry figure as he stood in the dock, prematurely aged, weathered by remorse and drink, and pained by severe rheumatism in his ankles. He attempted to withdraw his confession on the advice of his defence counsel, but his detailed statements had already sealed his fate, and he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Before he was hanged, he wrote a final letter of confession, a thank you note to his barrister, and a message of love to his wife. His rheumatism prevented him from walking, so 2 warders had to carry him to the scaffold, and he died on the gallows on 20th of April. The murder house in Tabernacle Street is no longer standing, but the Kean Castle pub was in existence until 1958. If the surgeons had not made a mistake and been adamant that the body was that of a much younger woman, and had instead publicised the fact that the victim was in her 50s, would Martha's family have been more likely to come forward and justice been served sooner? As so many years have passed, we can now only speculate. The Blackburn Sweeney Todd. I mentioned this intriguing case very briefly in my 7-part Jack the Ripper series, as it took place 12 years before the Whitechapel murders. Bloodhounds were brought in to try to track down the Ripper, and it was mentioned in the papers at the time that dogs had been successfully used in another murder investigation in 1876. I always wanted to learn more about that one, so here it is, the first ever case to be solved by a bloodhound. On 28th of March 1876, 7-year-old Emily Agnes Holland told her friends at St Albans School in Blackburn that she had just met a, quote, nice man, and that he had given her some money and asked her to buy him half an ounce of tobacco. She was last seen going out to play after coming home from school, but then vanished off the face of the earth. Her frantic father, mechanic James Holland, went to the police and an extensive search was conducted throughout Blackburn, but no clues were found. 2 days later, a local child found an ominous parcel that had been wrapped in newspaper and left in a field. The child picked it up and took it home, showing it to her neighbour Mrs. Alice White en route. Mrs. White opened the package and was horrified to see inside the torso of a small girl. Emily's heartbroken parents identified the remains as their daughter from a mark on her back. A local man reported seeing someone behaving suspiciously in a lane at Lower Cunliffe nearby, and another parcel was later found there, wrapped in old copies of the Preston Herald. This one contained 2 severed legs, which were a perfect match to the torso. Police surgeon Dr. William Maitland deduced that a very sharp knife had been used to perform the mutilation, and that the girl had been assaulted before she was murdered. Maitland was particularly interested in the fact that the newspapers used to wrap the body parts were covered with human hair of various lengths, colours and textures. He wondered who could have access to the hair of so many different people. Could the killer be a barber? Mary Eccles, the witness whom Emily had told she was going to fetch tobacco for a fella she had met, reported that she had caught a glimpse of this man in the street. He had worn a billycock hat, a cloth coat, a yellow waistcoat, dirty trousers and wooden clogs. This description led the Chief Constable, Mr. Potts, to believe that the murderer was a tramp, but the coroner was quick to point out that tramps don't often carry newspapers around with them. 3 vagrants were arrested on suspicion of involvement that week, but discharged due to lack of evidence. One in particular, a beggar named Charles Taylor, closely matched this description, and the police were proud and relieved to announce to the baying crowds of outraged townsfolk that they had a suspect in custody, whom medical examiners assessed as a dangerous lunatic. However, they continued the investigation in the meantime and followed up on Dr. Maitland's suspicions about barbers. It was noted that one local barber, 25-year-old William Fish of 3 Moss Street, had a pile of old Preston Heralds in the corner of his shop, which piqued the interest of detectives. He had been in the workhouse as a teenager and had 2 previous convictions for larceny, but was now married with 2 children. He was not officially charged with murder, but the rumour mill swiftly got to work, and it became known that he was a person of interest, and curious men and women would visit his barber shop just to get a good look at him. One woman came in and stared so unsettlingly that the barber asked what she had come for. "To see a murderer," she replied. Meanwhile, a group of street urchins outside bellowed, "Ya boo, Barber Barber, who killed the girl?" William Fish was eventually forced to ask for police protection from the furious Blackburn residents who were convinced that he was the guilty party. By now, vagabond Charles Taylor had been released, and the inquest was adjourned while the police continued their search for the killer. The newspapers began to question the abilities of law enforcement to solve the crime, but shortly afterwards, a dog handler named Peter Taylor, no relative of Charles, came forward to offer the help of his dogs, a Clumber Spaniel and a half-bred bloodhound called Morgan. In his youth, Morgan had had a bad habit of biting people and, for some reason, had a particular antagonism towards those who were scruffily dressed, but was now highly trained and obedient, and had once tracked a pair of poachers for 17 miles, leading to their capture. The dogs searched the areas where the girl's torso and legs had been found in the hope of finding the arms and head, which was still missing, but they couldn't pick up a scent. It was then suggested that the dogs were taken to the barber shops. At William Fisher's premises, both dogs bolted upstairs, where Morgan sniffed at some clothes, then ran into the front room, sniffing at the fireplace and barking, desperately trying to put his head up into the flue. The handler pulled the dogs back, and the police made a gruesome find. The burnt skull and arms of Emily Holland had been pushed up inside the chimney, wrapped in pieces of her clothing. At first, Fish denied his involvement in the girl's death, but eventually confessed to abducting Emily and sexually assaulting her in the room above the barber shop, then cutting her throat with a razor and dismembering her body. He had burned her head and arms in the fireplace and then tried to hide them up the chimney. Witnesses recalled seeing an unusually large fire in the barber shop the night of the girl's disappearance, and now realised that what they had seen was the murderer trying to destroy the evidence of his nauseating crime. It's unclear if this is true, but there was a spate of lurid gossip claiming that Fish had even shaved several customers with the same razor he had used to kill Emily. While Fish waited in prison for the trial, there was a flurry of hearsay about his origins, as the people of Blackburn refused to believe that such an abhorrent murderer could be British. Some claimed his real name was in fact Fish or Fishy, and contended that he was related to Giuseppe Marco Fischi, who had tried to assassinate King Louis Philippe of France. Others thought he was the grandson of notorious Corsican Jacopo Fish, who had been exiled after taking part in a Bonapartist plot. His daughter Marguerite had married an Italian anarchist, who was later guillotined for attempting to blow up Napoleon III, and the bloodthirsty barber was the result of this union. However, William Fisher's wife Elizabeth indignantly told the Blackburn Times that her husband was as English as they came, and the son of a printer born in Chorley. There was no chance of blaming the contemptible iniquity on a foreign-born killer. William Fish was a Blackburnian through and through. William Fish, who had now become known as the Demon Barber of Blackburn, stood trial at the Liverpool Assizes on 28th of July 1876. He denied premeditation, but it was evident that he had given a great deal of thought to the disposal of the body. 50 reporters from all over the country sat in court, scribbling down the most salacious parts of the proceedings to be printed in the next day's papers, and the public seating area was so full that many morbidly curious citizens were turned away, including several fashionably dressed ladies milling around outside trying to get in. The Rochdale Times reported, "It was well that they were refused admission, as the disgusting details of such a case are not fit for the ear of any woman." Fish was found guilty and sentenced to hang. He wrote his final words on a slate offered to him by the prison chaplain, which seemed to be a cautionary tale for others who might turn to evil ways. It read, "I wish to tell you, while you have a chance to lead a new life, you can see my bad end through breaking off Sunday school and through bad companions. Those were happy days when I attended Sunday school. After I neglected it, I went from bad to worse, and so I have been brought to this sad end. If I had my time over, I would lead a different life. It is not too late for you to mend. Avoid those bad, cheap journals on which I wasted so much time. May we meet in heaven through God's mercy." We can only assume that the bad, cheap journals he referred to were the notorious penny dreadfuls that were so ghoulishly popular at the time. At 8 a.m. on Monday 14th of August 1876 at Kirkdale Prison, Liverpool, William Fish was escorted to the gallows. He prayed audibly as he made his final steps and began to sing the hymn "Safe in the Arms of Jesus," the words drowned out by the white cap being placed over his head as the noose was tightened. He was hanged next to another man, Richard Thompson, who had been sentenced to death for killing a friend. As the bolt was drawn back by famous hangman Marwood, opening the trapdoor to the long drop of 7 feet, both men died without a struggle. A waxwork model of Fish was added to the Chamber of Criminals at Reynolds Royal Waxwork Exhibition in Lime Street, London, and a couple of weeks later, Madame Tussauds added his likeness to their Chamber of Horrors. As for Morgan, the bloodhound, his owner was offered £200 for him, but he turned it down and instead exhibited him at the Blackburn Theatre, earning £6 per evening. Morgan was a great favourite with the locals, and many stories were told about his achievement, with one person writing to the newspaper to suggest that he should be awarded with a silver collar inscribed with the date of his extraordinary find, which had led to the arrest of a murderer. Thank you for listening to Prash's Murder Map. If you like this Penny Dreadfuls episode, I've got 2 more for you to check out, and if you're interested in the Victorian era, you might also enjoy my Jack the Ripper series. I also have a full-length book about the Whitechapel murders called Jack the Ripper, Straight to the Jugular, which is available on Amazon. If you haven't already, check out my other true crime videos, which include the life and death of British serial killer John Martin Scripps, the enigmatic Lake Buda massacre, the mysterious Axeman of New Orleans, and the horrific Peak District murders. Links are in the description. This show is 100% independent and is researched, written and produced by myself and my wife, so your support is really appreciated. Please subscribe, give me a thumbs up, or leave me a comment or review. For news about my books and free true crime blog posts, check out my website www.prashganandran.com. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you again soon.